Germany. Now, there is a place that has long had a problem with the far right, and a new report from the country's equivalent of MI5 has discovered that right-wing extremism is the greatest threat to German democracy. It also identified as many as 14,000 violent right-wing extremists living there. Now, you may recall that late last year, 25 people were arrested on suspicion of plotting to overthrow the government. The majority of them were members of something known as the Reichsbürger movement, those who reject the authority and legitimacy of the German state and seek to ignore, replace, or even overthrow it. Now, the resurgence of extremist politics in a country perhaps most associated with the rise and spread of fascism is obviously worrying. So too, the growth of extremism being witnessed in other parts of Europe, including the UK. But what's not immediately obvious, to me at least, is what is fueling this extremist resurgence, let alone what can be done about it. Welcome to The Daily. I'm Neil Patterson.
Cards on the table, this has to have been possibly one of the most surreal experiences I've had in the last year.
Siobhan Robbins is Sky's Europe correspondent.
So I was investigating the right wing within Germany, and as part of that, I'd heard about this guy who was calling himself the King of Germany. He'd created his own kingdom. And so I got in contact with them and we decided to go and have a chat. We went down to the kingdom, which is about 2 hours outside Berlin. So this is the kingdom?
No, it's just the village. The kingdom is just an area.
So I drove up to the gates and there was basically a corrugated iron gate painted in green, like a kind of forest scene. And on the outside it said Kingdom of Germany.
Hello.
When I got into the drive, there was a little desk set up. And I was asked to fill out some information so that I could get a visa.
This is my ID for a visa, please.
Because, of course, I was visiting from outside the kingdom. And so I had to have a one-day visa to get in. So I presented my identity, got the visa, and then went into this very unassuming building to wait for this king.
How do I address you? Do you have a title?
Yes.
What do we say then?
King of Germany.
So I say, Your Majesty.
Yes.
So, yeah, I guess give me a little tour of the kingdom, of your kingdom.
So basically, his idea is that from around a decade ago, he decided to start the Kingdom of Germany, as they've called it, which is a group now of around just over 5,000 people. And they essentially don't accept the elected government and the current system within Germany. So they've created their own kingdom, which has its own rules. They've created their own ID. So he's got his own special passport. He's changed his name. So when he flies within Germany, he flies as King Peter I. They have their own banking system. And he showed me they've got old silver coins, and also they're going to roll out some banknotes as well. If other people in Germany accept it, he would like to see the Kingdom of Germany basically take over the whole of Germany as we know it, so that everyone living in Germany would be part of the kingdom.
You say he's incredibly charming. I'm just wondering if he's entirely the full shilling. I mean, you can't just buy a patch of land, stick up a corrugated fence, and call it your kingdom. Otherwise, frankly, I'd have done that 20 years ago.
Well, I asked him these questions, and he's quite clear that this isn't some sort of crackpot idea in his mind. This is an idea to make society work better. So he claims people who are within the kingdom, if they work for the kingdom, then they get their food for free, for example.
For free.
Oh, so they can come and get the food for free?
Yes, all food for free.
Every day?
Yeah, every day. Yes.
Wow. So they
Not
don't
only
have...
food for free, also gasoline for free, car for free, rent for free.
He claims the current system in Germany is totally unfair, that the monetary system is unfair, and so he's trying to create this alternative. But of course, you can imagine that someone who's declaring their own state and saying, actually, we'd like to see the current government dissolved and our state put in, doesn't play that highly on the views of the authorities within Germany. So he says that he has been under surveillance, and certainly as part of a report about extremism and potential domestic threats within Germany, the Kingdom of Germany is on that. And they are being monitored because of the fact that they've said they've created their kingdom, but also because they're being held together with a group a sort of quite disparate group within Germany, which are called Reichsbürger. And essentially, Reichsbürger as a whole are lots of different groups, but together they all believe that the current system is wrong. And some of them believe that basically the current government is illegal and that the German state should revert to how it was before the war, so that they want to get rid of post-war Germany as we now know it.
Okay, I can understand why you might describe someone who wants to secede from your country as an extremist. I'm not entirely certain why one would describe them as far right.
So the thing about the Reichsbürger is it's not just the kingdom, which the domestic authorities in German count in this group. There are around 23,000 Reichsbürger within Germany. And just before Christmas, we saw a group of people being arrested, 25 people, as part of raids to foil what the authorities say was a Reichsbürger plot to violently overthrow the government in Germany. Now, this wasn't connected to the Kingdom of Germany or King Peter. King Peter is very clear that none of his followers or he would support any type of violent coup to take over the government. But it was part of this Reichsbürger movement. And as part of this report, they've said around 10% of people who believe in this Reichsbürger are potentially violent. And that's why they're watching.
Okay, look, I mean, the figure of 14,000 violent right-wing extremists is clearly concerning, but I'd submit that more concerning than that is sitting in the Reichstag at the moment, you have far-right extremist politicians. Now, of course, they would say they are neither violent nor divisive, but surely it is still concerning to see politicians with far-right views sitting in a parliament so closely associated with fascism.
Yes, so one of the groups which is causing concern, particularly within the left wing, is the AfD, Alternative for Germany Party, which has 78 seats in parliament and elements of it are being watched by the security services. So, for example, one of what we call within that party, one of the right-wing poster boys has been charged with using a slogan which was apparently used by elements of the Nazi party. And certainly I spoke to a man called Suleiman Malik, who lives in East Germany, and he claims that he has been a victim of far-right extremism, which he believes that elements like the AfD are stoking. So he's been trying to build a mosque for 10 years. And part of the delay to that is because he said that workmen who were trying to come and work on the site were being threatened, being told that they shouldn't go and work for Muslims. That one day he turned up and that there was a pig's head on a stake and pork scattered around the site, that he's received numerous death threats as well. And he believes that there really is a concerning rise in right-wing thoughts in Germany.
Do you think there would be a lot of support if there was a coup that installed a right-wing government?
Yes, there will be.
You think there is?
Yes, there will be. There is.
Why?
Because they see that this is the solution. We saw the pictures in USA.
The fact you can't rule out the risk is because just in December, we saw these 25 arrests, which are allegedly connected to a plot to violently overthrow the government and to violently invade Parliament here in Germany. And that's why the authorities here are so vigilant. They said that right-wing extremism is the biggest threat domestically to democracy in Germany. That's how seriously they're taking it.
We must never underestimate the murderous danger posed by right-wing extremism and right-wing terrorism. That's the conclusion drawn by Germany's Interior Minister following the Security Service report, which identified that there were almost 39,000 right-wing extremists. Now, that is a figure up by more than 5,000 in just a year. But why? Julia Ebner is an academic specialising in radicalisation and right-wing extremism, and the author of Going Mainstream, How Extremists Are Taking Over.
Unfortunately, this is exactly what I've also observed in my own research. I've also done a number of undercover investigations into far-right extremist movements, including in Germany. And I've seen that the language there has become more aggressive and that the membership numbers have really risen to unseen levels, especially the pandemic, but also the Ukraine war and the ongoing economic and energy crisis and inflation crisis. All of that has caused a lot of frustrations within the German population, especially when it comes to the German politicians. So all of this has really widened societal divisions and has also caused a very high support for Germany's far-right populist party, the AfD.
You mentioned a number of reasons there, Julia, for the rise in extremism. You mentioned, the Ukraine conflict, obviously COVID. I mean, there would be those sitting outside of Germany that would have immediately thought, well, presumably Germany's fascist past has quite a lot to do with it as well.
It does also play a role, certainly. There's still a taboo in terms of speaking about nationalism, speaking about kind of pride. National pride is still something that is not really socially acceptable. And that has been of concern for many Germans who wanted to take pride in their country, in their origins. And that's also something that the far right has been able to tap into. And unfortunately, there have also been, of course, a number of crises where Germany has been particularly hard hit in the past. The so-called migration and refugee crisis a few years ago, but also the kind of security crisis that we saw with the rise of ISIS and a number of attacks, jihadist attacks that Germany has faced. Then that meant that anti-migration and xenophobic ideas could really penetrate the mainstream.
On the basis of that, one has to presume that these views are being shared most prominently online, that this is where the spread of these ideologies is most active.
It certainly is. And Germany is, I would say, based on my research, is one of the top countries when it comes to alternative media outlets and so-called citizen journalism, where a lot of these alternative media outlets position themselves in opposition to the so-called mainstream media, which is, of course, also a term that has then closely been associated with the old Nazi term Lügenpresse, which is now increasingly used by far-right extremists today in Germany, the lying press, basically, that actually often promote conspiracy myths and dangerous narratives and often a lot of disinformation about migrants, about, in general, minority communities, and about leading politicians. That has really also further amplified the dynamics that we're seeing.
Talk to me a little then about the Reichsbürger movement, because it seems fascinating to me that there is this loose collective of individuals who feel that the state doesn't represent them, to the extent that they wish to rise up, some of them, to overthrow the democratic constitutional norms of a country like Germany. Where does this come from? Because it does look associated with that which I would more typically call the far right, the fascist, the racist, the homophobic and so on. But it also seems slightly distinct to that as well.
It is. There's a strong overlap with the wider far-right extremist community. But as you say, it's a network of mainly anti-democratic, anti-institutional extremists or sovereign citizens who don't accept the constitution, the German constitution, and who partly would also turn to violence in order to overthrow the current government. Of course, not all of them can be seen as violent, but the number of Reichsbürger or of German sovereign citizens has also strongly risen in recent years. And it's no longer a fringe phenomenon. It's really in the tens of thousands. Some of them just refuse to pay taxes, but others might even consider resorting to violence. There have been plots to overthrow the German government, but even that is, of course, quite delusional and would be extremely unrealistic. But as we've seen with the US Capitol riots, even if it's an unsuccessful plot to storm a democratic institution or to enter a democratic institution, that can trigger a whole mass phenomenon of people further potentially being inspired by that, but also causing a lot of terror and a lot of fear, not just within policy circles, but also within the wider population. So I wouldn't underestimate to what extent they can influence the overall debate and the atmosphere in the country.
I suppose the key difference between England, the UK and Germany is that at this point, we do not have political representation of those far-right organisations in the mainstream. It still exists on the fringes. Why has it been tolerated in the mainstream in Germany?
That is a very good question. In the German mainstream, I would say that because the centrist parties have distanced themselves from these ideologies, that there was a representative vacuum that could be filled by the Alternative for Germany. But even the alternative, the far-right populist party, the Alternative for Germany, radicalized a lot over the last 10 years since it was founded. You could really observe that the language is now flirting with conspiracy myths, with extremist ideologies that are becoming much more visible. They've, of course, always been kind of embedded within the party's overall thinking and approach, but the party was originally founded actually as an anti-EU party, so not so different from kind of UKIP's goals. And what we've seen in the UK is also that, of course, within the Conservative Party, there has been a bit more of kind of taking up some of the audiences that would have otherwise potentially voted for fringe parties. I would say that the Conservative Party in the UK has sometimes also flirted with these audiences, kind of using anti-migration rhetoric, sometimes even giving a little wink to conspiracy myth communities. And that is something that has helped them to at least keep out the more radical extremist parties who've not really managed to get into power. But overall, it still tells us something about the wider societal atmosphere, which might still be one where extremism can thrive and can actually become mainstream.
I suppose the issue is that, whereas in your mind's eye, we may believe fascists to be, shaven-headed, jack-booted idiots, these days you're as likely to see them dressed in an expensive suit, speaking in, the German parliament.
Definitely, it's been quite an experience also in my undercover investigations that sometimes I could not really tell apart who the extremists actually were. And that even applies to the most extreme of extremists, the neo-Nazis, who are no longer recognizable in their clothing, where there's been a whole new trend of rebranding and making sure that they're seen as socially acceptable and as representative of the overall population, so they can also attract new members who are average citizens.
Some of the parallels we were just discussing there between England and Germany, frankly, you could provide plenty of evidence that there is similar activity in large parts of the United States amongst the Republican movement. Tell me a little bit about the States and Europe.
The US is, of course, a very good example of a radicalization of politics that we could observe, especially since the rise to power of Trump in 2016, where it's almost as if the Republicans have forgotten what the party stands for, because Trump doesn't really represent any form of conservatism anymore. It's much more radical than that. So it's interesting how also the attitudes within the population have, of course, changed over the years and have become partly more radical. We've seen that in surveys, for example, conducted by the University of Chicago that showed the high support rates within the US populations for the insurrectionist movement behind the US Capitol riots. So there is a question of what radicalized first, the politicians or the voters.
I wonder, however, though, through your research, you will have seen, I'm sure, evidence that these groups in different parts of the world, but sharing some kind of central core ideas, they are talking to each other, they're communicating with each other, and they are advising each other.
There's absolutely a very strong international collaboration or even coalition that has formed on the far right, but also among hyper-conservative players. So evangelical movements in the US that have been funding activities in Europe, campaigns against the LGBTQ community, against abortion rights. We've seen the first consequences of that also showing up in European politics and on the other side of the Atlantic. And that's, of course, very concerning.
My thanks to Julia and Siobhan, and that is your lot for today's edition of The Daily with me, Neil Patterson. This episode was produced by Rosie Gillett with Alex Eden and Amy Lakin. Our editor is Adam J.
An armed uprising in Russia has ended after the head of the Wagner mercenary group ordered his troops to stand down. Yevgeny Prigozhin abandoned his attempt to overthrow Russia's military commanders after striking a deal with the Kremlin. Wagner forces have now withdrawn from the southern city of Rostov-on-Don, where they earlier occupied the district military headquarters. Prigozhin says Wagner is pulling its troops back to avoid spilling Russian blood. The Kremlin says he will move to Belarus and all criminal charges against him and his soldiers will be withdrawn. For more on this, let's talk to Stefan Meister. He's head of the Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia and Central Asia at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Hello, sir. Can I first get your reaction to events in Russia this weekend?
Yeah, I think we were all surprised what is possible in Putin's Russia. For me, Prigozhin is like a black swan. It's something neither we expected nor the Putin system expected, and it was not prepared for such a kind of coup from inside, you could say. And I think it showed the weaknesses of the Putin system. It showed that this system is so personalized that when Putin not reacts immediately, the system does not know what to do. And in the end, Prigozhin got what he wanted. He's a free man, at least for some time being. So I think it's a very bizarre coup and very bizarre result of this coup.
Bizarre, as you say. I mean, Ukraine is describing this as a public humiliation for President Putin and that he is weakened. You sort of seem to suggest that earlier. But the case is Putin is still in power and so are his military chiefs. So isn't this proof of Putin's resilience?
No, I think it showed for me really the weakness of Putin and the Putin system. I think his speech was for me representative for me a kind of loss of reality. He did not understand that he seemed not to understand that he is really challenged in this moment. Sure, I think everybody supported in the end Putin from the top of the military and also in the system. But for a short period of time, the state lost the power of force in Russia. And I think that's the worst thing which can happen in an authoritarian state and in a so personalized state. So for me, it shows really the weaknesses of the Putin system. And I think it undermines really Putin's legitimacy in a way.
Okay, does the end of the rebellion mean this is the end of the threat to Putin's power, or do you think this is only the beginning?
I don't think that he's really threatened or that he will soon lose power, but we see that he's less strong than we expected, and that there can be events today, tomorrow, in 1 week or in 1 month, which suddenly change the whole situation in Russia. So it's more fragile than we think, but it can also survive much longer than we hoped for.
I guess only time will tell. Yevgeny Prigozhin and Vladimir Putin, they go way back. One could argue that Putin helped him rise from former convict, which he was, to millionaire. So is this a crisis of Putin's own making, you think?
I think he underestimated Prigozhin in a way. And I think what we also see is that there was no contact between both anymore. So Prigozhin needed this to create a situation to get the attention of Putin and get the confirmation that he will be alive. Yeah, because I think Putin didn't support him anymore. When we saw this already since a couple of weeks, that he lost the support of Putin. So he needed the personal guarantee of Putin, and he got it in the end. But I think Putin really didn't realize that he lost the control over Prigozhin. And again, I think that's for me a sign of a personalized system which does not realize anymore what's going on and which has only limited information about the military offensive, about the war, and about what is going on with figures like Prigozhin.
What do you think Putin's next steps will be?
I think for the time being, he confirmed that Prigozhin is free, the free man. But I think that will not last long. He needs to show that if you do these kind of things, you will not survive. So I don't think that Prigozhin is really safe, at least not in middle and long term. But I think he might also change the laws, make even more stricter laws inside of the country. And then I think we will have a kind of propaganda which will maybe really let the people forget what happened. So I think he needs to show strength, Putin, at this point. But difficult to say how he will show this strength.
He needs to show some strength, you say. Is Putin more or less dangerous today than he was yesterday after all that's happened?
No, I think he was already dangerous. I think he has no limits anymore. So I think it's not that he's more dangerous. Yes, sure, he's maybe more weakened, and that makes him even more dangerous. But I don't see. So I think it's not for Ukraine or for the West. It's maybe for Russia and people inside of Russia. So maybe people are less safe now, even more less safe than before inside of Russia. That's maybe the case. So he might be even more paranoid also about coups. And that means even more repressive. So I think it's more about domestic Russia and safety of people in the system than about Ukraine or the West.
Stefan Meister with the German Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure.
I spoke earlier to DW's former Moscow bureau chief, Yuri Resheto, who's now based in Riga. That's because DW is banned from Russia. I asked him what's happening in Moscow and the Russian cities Wagner briefly controlled.
Well, Russia is obviously trying to get back to normality as quickly as possible, Eddie. As if nothing had happened, things are being downplayed that seemed so big and so important yesterday. The highways to Moscow, which were blocked, will be reopened. It's said damaged streets are supposed to be renovated within 2 days. Buses are running between the Russian capital and the cities in the south. At the same time, the so-called counter-terrorist operation regime introduced in Moscow and the Moscow region continues to operate. Kremlin spokesman Peskov said that it would be cancelled in the very near future, though also the Moscow authorities decided not to cancel the day off that was scheduled yesterday for tomorrow, Monday. So many Moscovites joke and thank Prigozhin for an extra day off.
That's interesting, but we've seen a lot of pictures across social media. What do you make of the images of people celebrating Wagner forces as they left Rostov?
Well, it was a very bizarre day for many people in Russia, of course, and yes, especially for the Russians in Rostov. When tanks came to the city, into the city, people gathered in the center. Some of them posed in front of the tanks and took pictures. Some talked to the soldiers. It seemed that the armed men were for many in Rostov a kind of attraction rather than the real threat. But everyone was at the same time, of course, worried because no one knew how this will end. So when finally the troops withdrew, of course, there was relief. And of course, maybe one of the other was happy that Prigozhin had publicly humiliated the Kremlin and the Russian president. But we shouldn't be naive and think that Russians now are suddenly rising up against Putin and demonstrating against the war. I definitely don't think that will be happening soon.
And now, as part of the deal with the Kremlin, Prigozhin was to relocate to Belarus. Do we know his whereabouts?
No, we don't hear anything about where Prigozhin is at the moment. We just know that the Kremlin spokesman Peskov said yesterday that he should go to Belarus and be freed from any persecution, which sounds weird given that just yesterday morning Prigozhin faced up to 20 years in prison.
So, with all that's been happening, what impact could this have on Vladimir Putin's grip on power?
I think, Eddie, that Putin's power has definitely been weakened since yesterday. I don't know if that was Prigozhin's goal, but Prigozhin showed that something is pretty wrong in the Russian state, in a country where people could be put behind bars for years if they protest against the power of the state. In this country, one man takes up arms in hand and makes demands. And that's why the Kremlin will now do everything possible, I think, to make yesterday's mutiny forgotten as quickly as possible. But one shouldn't think that Putin's power is crumbling. We saw yesterday that everyone from the Federation Council and the Duma to Chechen leader Kadyrov really all backed Putin, at least publicly. And now, after this failed coup, it will be interesting to see whether the laws in Russia will be even tightened.
Quick one on this before you go. How is all this being reported on in Russia?
Well, look, many people in Russia remembered yesterday the 1990s when the then Soviet President Gorbachev was being held in Crimea and there was an attempt coup. At that time, Soviet television continuously aired Tchaikovsky's ballet Swan Lake. Since then, it's a kind of symbol for political uprising in Russia. This time, the news anchor of the Russian state television appeared in the night and interrupted the current program to report on Prigozhin. And you could see that the state propaganda didn't really know how to deal with someone who just the day before yesterday was being celebrated as a hero in Russia.
DW's Yuri Resheto, thank you.